and you're live.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody to this meeting of Bracknell Forest's executive being broadcast over Zoom in accordance with current government guidelines. First item on the agenda today is apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies, please, Hannah?
No, none notified, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Which takes us on to the second item, which is declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of disclosable pecuniary or affected interests, please, from anyone? No. If we don't, then the usual caveat, please, that should such an interest become apparent at any point during the proceedings, please feel free to interrupt the proceedings to record that, that interest if it is disclosable. It takes us to agenda item 3, which is the minutes, to consider and approve the minutes of the meeting of the executive that was held on the 26th of January, of which we've all had notification. Thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor Birch. Is that seconded?
That's seconded, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dr. Barnard. And if anybody does not agree with those, will you please signify accordingly? And if nobody shows dissent, we will assume assent from everyone. And so if we can please record that those minutes are approved. Thank you. Now, Hannah, do we have any urgent items of business under agenda item 4?
None notified, Chair, but before we move on to the items, can we do a roll call just so
yes, indeed,
those watching know who's here?
That's fine. Over to you. Thank for the roll call. Will members please switch their microphones on?
Thank you. Councillor Bettison.
Present.
Councillor Dr. Barnard.
Present, but I'm afraid it's Hannah, it's a very shaky line here, but present for the time being.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Birch.
Present.
Councillor Bruno Walker.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Harrison.
Present.
Councillor Mrs. Hayes.
Present.
Councillor Hayden.
Present.
And Councillor Turrell.
Present.
Thank you. Back over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you. Right, which we come now to agenda item 5, which is vehicle emissions and air quality, which begins on page 19 and is to be initially introduced by the Executive Director of Delivery.
Leader, if it's okay, I think
okay.
I'll be taking this as an introduction before I hand over to Sean, if that's okay, Leader.
Mr. James, yes, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly, that this paper sets out some recommendations in relation to tackling air quality and vehicle emissions in the borough. The Executive recently agreed the Council's climate change strategy, and the items put forward for consideration in this paper are specifically identified in the action plan, which sits alongside the strategy. And as such, they're an important step in the borough's fight to reduce the impact of climate change. I'll hand over to Sean, who's our Public Protection Manager, to talk through the detail in the paper and pick up any detailed questions. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Good evening, Leader, Cabinet. Yes, so effectively the paper before you tonight really sets out options really for the Executive on a policy position in relation to enforcement. So as Damien has explained, this is part of the wider climate change strategy, but it's also part of a wider air quality strategy that has been adopted for the borough, which includes lots of things that are set out in the paper, particularly around things like public awareness and obviously monitoring and submitting annually the reports back to DEFRA on the state of air quality within the borough. What's proposed tonight really is these two issues. The first thing is that as a matter of policy that the council does look to enforce, as part of a wider package of measures, those provisions that relate to the idling of vehicles. So this is, there are a number of exemptions in relation to the idling of vehicles, such as things like stuck in traffic, but we're talking about basically parked up idling of vehicles. And as I say, this is only part of a wider package, which is very much around public awareness. And we see very much enforcement as a last resort. Sorry. The second element of the report is really dealing with basically a request for the executive to consider granting authority to make an application to the Secretary of State in relation to the carrying out of roadside vehicle emissions testing. So a local authority where they have an air quality management area, of which there are two in Bracknell that are set out in the report. So you've got the Bagshot Road A322 and you've got Crowthorne High Street, are able to apply to the Secretary of State at DEFRA for authority to carry out roadside emissions tests. And that just doesn't cover those roads, but may also extend to roads that feed into those roads and out of them. In and out of the air quality management areas as such. So the paper before you really sets out the sort of broader package of measures that we're looking at with relation to air quality and the two policy decisions really that we're seeking from executive tonight. I'm happy to take any questions if I can assist. Leader, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Murphy. Thank you. And colleagues, do we have any questions at this moment? Yes, Councillor Dr. Barnard.
Thank you. One of the question I've got is that, as you said at the start, the last resort round this is enforcement. We know the issues behind the idling of vehicles and what they can do. How are we going to ensure that members of the public understand why we are taking this particular aspect very seriously? I mean, it's set out in the report around, the emission of various gases and things. But people might think if they've got a catalytic converter, for example, that they're okay. So how are we going to let people know that actually, even with all of those things and AdBlue and all those things, these things are still real issues? Because otherwise it makes enforcement, I think, a little unfair.
If I may, Leader, yes. I mean, I agree. I think what leads to this is a campaign of explanation, a little bit like like we've seen effectively with the COVID regulations and the police. So we're talking about basically explaining, engaging, all of those type of things, basically prior to we reaching that very last point about enforcement. We don't really see enforcement is far from the starting point with this. It is the end point for those very, very final persistent offenders, basically. But up until that, for example, the type of stuff we're looking at is working with, for example, schools to get information out. And in fact, actually, as I'm sat here in the office that I'm in now, the banners are ready to go on to things like school outside of schools and things like this to raise awareness of things like air quality and issues around idling and things like that. So I think what we're saying is it sits there amongst that whole package of measures. Basically is the ultimate measure, but certainly very far from the first one. And as you say, I think public understanding of that is very much at the beginning of that journey.
No, thank you very much. Obviously you can cover the others. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Are there any other questions? No. Well, if there's no further questions, if I can ask Councillor Harrison if you'd like to move.
Thank you, Leader. Yes, I'd like to move the recommendations in two that we agree.
Thank you.
That's seconded. That's seconded.
That's seconded. Thank you very much, Councillor Dr. Barnard. Back to Councillor Harrison.
Thank you. Very sadly, in December, a young girl died. Her name was Ella Kissy Deborah, and she had severe asthma. But the coroner said that failure to reduce pollution levels to legal limits in the area where she lived was a contributory factor to her death. And that was a very rare case, but air pollution does contribute to ill health, death among a significant number of people in this country. And we do have a couple of hotspots in the borough where we do know we've got a problem with certain pollutants being higher than they need to be. These policies are a a toolkit that we need to be able to use in order to clean up air where we have to in our borough. And we need to be able to, the final sanctions here, in order to persuade some people to change their behaviour in terms of idling outside schools and certain other places. So I'd commend this to the executive, and I hope you'll be able to support these policies.
Thank you very much, Councillor Harrison. Would the seconder like to speak?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm really pleased Chair, the recommendation is before us, and also it was really great to hear Sean talk about the the campaign of information around this, because actually the sad thing is, particularly in the mornings when people idle their engines outside schools, they're well below their optimum operating condition, and they might feel that catalytic converters and other technologies will reduce the impact of emissions. Far from it. Coal catalytic converters don't do it. And paragraph 5.1, talks about the things which engines emit. And when an engine's not working at optimum temperature, when an engine is not at its best, or catalytic converters, the quantity of emissions is significantly higher. And I think all we can do just to persuade people that it really is worth switching the engine off, even on a cold morning, for 4 to 5 minutes, can make a massive difference, not just in terms of CO2 emissions, but also actually what it does for the air quality in the area. And Councillor Harrison pointed out that sadly, a young person, died in December because of this. But severe asthma, respiratory illness, and other things linked to particulate emissions to poor quality air is a big factor. And I think what I feel, Chair, is around this is that this is one of a number of measures that we look at in terms of climate change, improving our environment, that will be sort of stepped out over time. And I think our commitment is very clear to this. And this is what we'll do. It is, as said, always difficult at the end of the day when you have to consider a regime that might ultimately result in a sanction. But I'm convinced, as we have seen with the vast majority of people during the COVID period so far, that when people are presented with some well-reasoned evidence, advice and guidance, that they will act on that. So we don't actually need to go to that point. But we do have to have that ultimate sanction for those people who don't actually recognise that this is a real issue. And of course, it's an issue that we're learning more about all the time. And that's why, it's never too late to act on this. And if we look at the hotspots, if we look outside schools, we look at those areas where this is most likely to have the impact. I think by raising awareness now through this, I think we can make a significant and sustainable change, because it will be many years before car-based technology will have moved on to the point where this is no longer an important issue. We've got another 10, 15, 20 years where we need to look at this to ensure that, that we minimise the risk to our residents, improve the air quality across the borough, and actually have a positive and lasting impact on climate change.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dr. Barnard. Councillor Birch, you're next.
Thank you, Chairman. Supporting the motion 100%. I'm not sure whether I should have declared an interest, but I'm a long distance cyclist as my hobby, and I can assure you the effect of emissions, both from moving vehicles and from stationary vehicles, was before lockdown really quite troublesome. And I used to ride back 3 or 4 hours after start of a ride, and I'd have a croaky throat and a sore throat because of the pollutants that I'd had to ride through. And coming back off a ride, coming past a school, you could see people in their cars idling away. So it wasn't just the children outside the school that were likely to have health impacts. It was others like myself who pride themselves on keeping fit that were actually being adversely affected. So I'm keen to see this used. I hope we don't have to use it too many times for people to get the message that it is antisocial behaviour to idle your car anywhere without a valid reason as such. But totally support it, and the other side of my support comes from my position as executive member for health, absolutely supporting it. And I know that our residents will be very strongly behind this. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Birch. Councillor Turrell next.
Thanks, Leader. Yes, I welcome this. It's important to remember with air quality in the borough that we have had by law to monitor the air quality for a fair number of years now, since we had the air quality management areas come in, and we have managed to keep things fairly stable. With the air quality in Bracknell Forest, you're looking at NOx. You're looking at NOx rather than particulates, which are much more serious. So that's a good point. It's right, though, not to be complacent. It's and it's important that that we do address this habit. It's not just cars outside schools. It's delivery drivers and taxi drivers who I think are frequent ones who leave their vehicles idling, which is I think an issue not to be disregarded. But I think the engage, encourage, educate approach to start with is the right one, and hopefully we can just get it across to people that this is an undesirable habit, and with with potentially very serious consequences if it's allowed to multiply. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Councillor Turrell. And would the mover like to round up? Sorry, Councillor Hayden, do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Chair. Just very briefly, because everything's been said, but I really want to echo Councillor Birch's comments about, he said, he had to declare an interest as a cyclist. I think we all have to declare an interest in this because it's our environment and it's a very serious part of it. The other point is that it is part of an overall strategy in terms of our environmental responsibilities, a vital part as well, but just it reflects the council's care for the environment and going forward in a sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hayden. Councillor Mrs. Hayes.
Councillor Hayden said the line. I was going to say one sentence, sir. This is a positive move forward on our borough, showing we have a strategy and we're going to meet it. And the climate change we take seriously. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mrs. Hayes. And would the mover like to sum up, Councillor Harrison?
Yeah, I think the points made in this debate have been quite right. Councillor, we all have to declare an interest. We all actually need to breathe. And we'd all like to be able to do it without having to wear a mask in the open air and actually breathe clean air. But even so, things like nitrous oxide will go through the mask and they're bad for people's lungs regardless. So thank you for your support in this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Colleagues, if anybody does not support this, would they please indicate? And failing seeing anyone dissent, we will assume assent from everyone, in which case that is passed unanimously. Thank you very much indeed, colleagues, and thank you to Sean Murphy and Damien James. Thank you. And that takes us on to agenda item 6, I beg your pardon, which is the School Places Plan and Capacity Strategy. That's to be introduced by our Assistant Director, Chris Taylor. Or is Rachel?
I defer to Rachel.
Rachel's going to introduce things first. Okay. Hi there, Rachel.
Hi there. Good evening.
Hi.
Yeah, just to introduce, as you've just said, our School Place Planning and Capacity Strategy. The recommendation is that the plan is approved from 2021 to 2025. I'll hand over to Chris Taylor, who has a little bit more detail and can answer any questions as appropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Taylor.
Good evening, colleagues. So you've got the school places plan in your agenda packs. The council has the statutory duty to provide sufficient school places, and the school places plan is the tool by which we work out how many places we're going to need in future years, and it's a 5-year forecast. It was last approved by the executive this time last year for the years 2020 to 24, and we have updated it and brought it up to date with the latest information. And this forecast that's before you this evening is from 2021 to 2025. It continues to be a 5-year forecast. There's a lot of stuff in the school capacity strategy and school places plan, but I would like to draw the executive's attention to 1 or 2 salient points within the school places plan itself. Starting at, if you have that in front of you, graph 3.2, which is the population in the borough, which clearly shows that the school age population is decreasing at the moment, and it is likely to be decreasing for the next 5 years. And we have there a data which comes to us from the National Health Service, from the number of babies born, and we also have a second data stream which backs this up, which is the Government's Office of National Statistics population forecast. So the background, the context for school places over the next 5 years is a falling number of school-age children. I would like to draw your attention to graph 2 on 3.3 in the plan, which is the number of new houses completed. And as members know, there is a great deal of house building still going on across the borough. It has been fairly constant for the last 10 years or so at around 400 completions per annum, but it spiked last year to something like 1,700. And this is the backlog of new housing that has been planned to come forward has finally been achieved. But if members looked at that graph for the number of new housing completions, I don't want to be alarmist, because we think that the peak demand from new housing is not likely to be seen until between 5 and 7 years from the start of that development. So whilst there was a peak last year, we're not expecting it to have a material effect on the overall downward trend, certainly not in the short term. The actual key forecasts for primary and for secondary for the intake years are set out on graphs 14 and 22. And so for primary, we currently have about an 11% surplus of places in the intake year. That is forecast to rise to something like a 20% surplus over the coming 5 years. For secondary, we have about a 9% surplus of places, which is forecast to rise to something like an 11% surplus of places. So those are the background figures for both primary and for secondary. What I will add is that there is the DfE have issued a new consultation document on how to forecast for school places, and it is likely that they will be issuing new guidance in April on the methodology that we use to forecast school places, which will apply to next year's forecast. So that's the 2022 to 2026 school places plan. So we are expecting that to be a little bit different in the way that places are forecast, with perhaps a little more emphasis on a more centralised regime, with more information coming from the government and with less input required from different local authorities. So, I mean, that's all I was going to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions that the executive may have on any aspects of the school places plan and capacity strategy.
Thanks very much indeed, Mr. Taylor. I have a question from Councillor Mrs. Hayes.
Yes, sir. Councillor Taylor, I nearly said, Mr. Taylor, you mentioned something that I am looking at myself in the area with regards to food waste and different things, the consultation methodology. Yeah. I noted over and it's something I would expect or hope would be amongst the papers, is the downsizing of the older person is like a generation turnaround. And I am noting in the area of my own ward, a good movement of younger people, when I say younger people, 40-years, in the paperwork, then this is where I'm getting to. Have we taken into consideration that we have quite not where we're not building or whatever, but the fulfillment of others taking over properties, young persons, and these persons being parents of outside. In the area I'm in at the moment, I can take you to 5 houses at this point in time where the young persons, 40-year-olds, are moving in. And is there a paper that shows the movement of across borders from other councils?
Yes, perhaps I can take those one at a time. So
Yes.
you asked about, well, first of all, the cross-border movement, and there is a table in the school places plan that shows that we are net exporters of school places, and you will find that chart. It's graph 3 at 0.15 in the report.
I noted that, thank you.
So we are net exporters. In terms of the number of houses, we measure housing completions. It's very, very difficult to know who is going to buy those houses. But I do know if we look beyond just school age population, the background demographic shows that we have an aging population. In other words, people who are perhaps older than childbearing age in terms of the proportion of the population is becoming greater than the younger age group, which is the childbearing age group. So if you like, there's an explanation there in terms of why it is that the school age population. I don't publish hard data on that because I'm really just looking at the school age population, but certainly who buys the houses and what they do with them does have a bearing. We have done pupil yield research, which suggests that up to 85%, something like 85% of the people who buy new houses in Bracknell Forest, if they're moving within Bracknell Forest, they don't move their children. They keep their children in the existing school where they are. So that adds a sort of in terms of the way new houses come on stream. They're certainly bought by people, but they might not necessarily, the people who move to them might not necessarily bring their children from the other school. So this accounts for, it's one of the factors that accounts for the delay factor that I mentioned in terms of the peak demand for new housing being realised. So I don't think I've got accurate information on the numbers of 40-year-olds. We could probably find that, and it probably is relevant.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Mrs Hayes. Any further questions for Mr Taylor? Yep, okay, in which case, Councillor Dr Barnard, would you like to move?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to move recommendation 2.1 to approve the school places plan and school capacity strategy 2021 to 25 in the attached Appendix A, which is available on the public website for those that wish to see the.
Thank you. Is that seconded? Anybody?
Seconded.
Thank you, Councillor Birch. Thank you. And back to you, Councillor.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Chair. I first of all really want to thank Chris Taylor, the admissions team, for all the work they've done on this. What we have before us for the second year running now is I think it's what's becoming a tried and tested, incredible method for looking at the requirements for pupil places going forward. And why this is so critical is because for those that understand funding around schools are funded on a per pupil basis. So it is important that wherever possible, that we match the number of children we have to the number of school places available. And as colleagues will know, that sometimes means we have to take difficult decisions. But I think we should put on record that the engagement of governing boards, their teachers and others in this has been great in terms of looking at the way forward. As Chris says, at the current time, there are a number of things that influence this. And what really we're seeing is, at this point in time, compared to a period of time 3, 4, 5 years ago, that the pupil yield, that's the number of pupils that are yielded by each household, is significantly lower than it was probably a decade ago or a generation ago. And we have to take account of that in our planning. And buried in this is some very, very detailed work that Chris has done to hypothetically model and match what he thinks was going to happen with what happened. And actually, that certainly for the last couple of years has been very close. I should also add at this stage that this plan goes to a number of other groups, including the Schools Forum. The Schools Forum has taken a look at the work that Chris and team has done in bringing this plan together and has supported the approach and methodology. Chris did say in his introduction, that there'll be a more centralised approach to this going forward, and that we will get more data on to work with, and there'll be less input from us. That could be good in some ways, but I think it's also important to say that centralised data might not always pick up what we're seeing on the ground. And I'll give you one example in conclusion. A significant amount of housing has been built in a part of Bracknell over the last few years. And what's become clear that not just in Bracknell Forest in terms of children not moving when people move schools, we're also seeing evidence that children are not being moved from the schools where they've moved from to, with parents undertaking in the short to medium term longer journeys. Now that might well even out as we go forward, but actually we need to be, as Councillor Mrs Hayes raised in her question, conscious of that migration across borders, because fundamentally Bracknell Forest is quite small. So I think it's a good, solid, credible piece of work. And I finished by thanking Chris Taylor and his team and all his colleagues for working on this, because if nothing else, we have a credible basis going forward to have those conversations with schools that we need to, and to ensure that our schools are able to be financially viable and deliver the best educational outcomes for children. Because matching the two means we spend the money that we get per pupil on delivering good education outcomes, and that's why it's important we get this plan right.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Dr. Barnard. And would the seconder like to speak? Councillor Birch? Your reserve, okay. Any other contributions to debate? No. Who?
Councillor Hayden has his hand up.
Thank you, Councillor Hayden. Would you like to speak?
I apologise, Chair. It's an old hand.
Oh, okay, fine. All right. In which case, back to Councillor Birch.
In that case, Chairman, very quickly, one of the most important things we do as a council is ensure that places are provided for our young people. And I think this plan, the data in this will allow us, hopefully, to do it especially well. And I look forward to the time when we have those younger families filling our schools. And certainly I'm hoping that lockdown will assist in filling those schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Birch. Councillor Dr. Barnard, do you wish to sum up?
I think we just note the comments Councillor Birch made, because I don't believe there's an answer to some of those. But fundamentally, I think the key thing is it's by making sure that the demand is there where it's needed in the right place. Actually also helps us meet our climate change and environmental objectives as well, because ideally, of course, we want children, particularly at primary level, but also secondary, to be able to walk to a local school, to take cars off the road, and actually to be schooled in the local area. So, with that, happy to recommend this to the executive.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And can anybody who is not supportive of this please indicate now? And as nobody has indicated by assent, that is carried unanimously. Thank you very much, and thanks very much indeed, Mr. Taylor. That's and will you please pass on our gratitude to all your team who have continued to look into the crystal ball, because I don't envy that particular task at all, especially at primary age for obvious reasons. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And that takes us, colleagues, to agenda number 7, agenda item 7, which begins on page 65. And that's the revised local development scheme for 2021 to 24. And that's to be introduced by our Director of Place Planning and Regeneration. Thanks very much indeed, Mr. Hunter.
Thanks, Leader. So the purpose of this report is to update the Council's local development scheme. The LDS, as it's known, is essentially a document that sets out the time frame for completion of parts of the Council's development plan. So essentially the framework in which we make planning decisions. So the document before Executive tonight is an update on the LDS, which was published in 2019, and essentially covers 3 pieces of work. So it covers the time frames for the Bracknell Forest Borough Local Plan, the Central and Eastern Berkshire Minerals and Waste Local Plan and the policies map. So essentially, it's really setting out to the public what the council intends to do in terms of producing its development plan and what time frame it will do that in. It's part of national planning guidance that we prepare an LDS, and it essentially is giving the public an indication of what we're doing, when we're doing it, and when certain plans will come into force. So essentially the document before the executive has been updated from the 2019 version to pick up any changes to those timeframes, and the executive are asked to bring that version of the document into effect. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And colleagues, do we have any questions for Mr. Hunter? I don't think so. So thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hunter, and we'll move on to Councillor. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Miss Councillor Harrison, did you have a question?
Sorry, Sam. Yeah, I've just worked out how to put my hand up in Zoom meeting. It's going to be very useful from now on.
Thank you.
I noticed the report tells us that because of the policy planning policy framework, we need to look ahead 15 years now. I mean that the number of homes we're going to planning within the forthcoming planning period is going to be substantially different because we're going ahead further than we otherwise would do.
So local plans always look forward for that 15-year plan period. You ultimately look at the number of houses that you're required to provide on a yearly basis, and then that, you know, cast forward for the 15 years. So it's no different from any other planning local plan that we will have prepared before, and essentially 15 years is the time frame in which the national government expects us to plan for.
Okay, thank you. Any other? Yes, Councillor Mrs. Hayes, a question.
Just following up from there. So land banking, we take into consideration the length of time that some of these developers are holding this land. This is part of our.
So not necessarily related to this report, but essentially when you're planning forward in terms of the number of houses, you look at the supply. So essentially what's in your local in terms of numbers and what's already got a planning permission, and they count towards your numbers. But this is just the time frame in which this document is just about the time frame in which we're taking forward those documents.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. If there are no further questions, then Councillor Turrell, over to you to move the motion.
Thanks, Leader. I'd like to move recommendation on page 65 of the agenda document. Thanks.
Happy to second that, Councillor Dale Birch.
Thank you very much, Councillor Birch. Councillor Turrell, over to you.
As has been said, a timetable on our main planning policy document, the local plan, the minerals and waste local plan, the policies map. Important documents that set out our future and make it clear what the different uses of land in our borough will be. The minerals and waste local plan is currently on the consultation on the submission version, so that will go to examination later this year, and the plan isn't far behind it in terms of its place in the process. So this document gives people an update as to what the relevant dates are and what the relevant documents are. So a useful navigational aid for those wanting to know more about planning policy in this borough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Turrell. Thank you. And would anyone else like to speak before the seconder, or would the seconder like to speak now?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Birch.
Thank you. The important thing about what we're doing here is we are publishing to everyone what the plan for delivering our most important planning documents are. This is not the actual planning policy document, but it sets out everything that our residents can expect from us in terms of creating and then delivering on those policies that have a direct effect on all of us. And so that's the extent of the importance of this. And one of the things that we have to make sure within this is that when things change, we're able to change as well. And I certainly know that in the next couple of years, we're likely to see quite extensive change. And so times in planning are likely to get a bit troublesome and a bit confusing. And one of the things I'm looking forward to the LDS, the Local Development Scheme, doing is giving us that base, that bedrock upon which to base the work that we're doing to deliver those policies. So totally support it and thank all the officers that put together this and all the other extensive library of supporting documents, SPDs and so on and so forth, that allow our residents to see just how seriously this administration takes the planning and delivery of appropriate housing, appropriate jobs, and the proper use of our space and the awareness of our heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Birch. Thank you. Councillor Turrell, would you like to sum up?
Yes, I think the essential point about these documents is it's important to come up to date, and by having an up-to-date local plan and indeed an up-to-date minerals and waste local plan, it gives us greater say in how our borough is developed and how the land is used. If the policies are up to date, then there's less chance of challenge from those who would try and do things differently. They go through a considerable amount of evidence building, and the process of examination is rigorous. So when that's been done, we do have some important documents there. This document tells us about when that will happen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Turrell. And colleagues, if anyone does not agree with this recommendation, would they please show now? And given that nobody has dissented, by assent, that is again carried unanimously. Thank you very much indeed, and thanks very much indeed to the officers concerned. And if Mr. Hunter would be good enough to take back our congratulations to his team on a very helpful document throughout. Thank you. Right, colleagues, that takes us on to agenda item 8, beginning on page 99, which is the capital programme for the council for the years 2021 to 2 and 2023 to 24. That's to be introduced by our Director of Resources. Thank you indeed, Mr. McKellar.
Thank you, Chair. This is the first of 2 reports on tonight's agenda, setting out the final budget proposals for consideration of the Executive before they move on to the Council meeting on the 24th of February. When I introduce the revenue budget report, I will say more about the impact of the finance settlement and the consultation, which has been undertaken since December, since the draft proposals were published. But in terms of the capital programme proposals, they are the same as were presented to the Executive in December. So therefore, I don't think there's much more to add at this point, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. McKellar. Thank you. Are there any questions for the officer at this stage? No, in which case we'll move on to Councillor Peter Hayden, who's going to move the motion, I hope.
Thank you, Leader. Yes, your hope is not in vain. I'd like to move the recommendations to the capital budget, which are on page 99 of our papers.
Thank you.
1 HE.
Thank you. And
Happy to
who's?
second that.
Thank you very much, Councillor Birch. Thank you. Back to you, Councillor Hayden.
As the Director of Resources said, there is a little of a crossover here between this and the next item on the agenda. But as always, it's focused. There is an additional focus on grants and external contributions and capital receipts, just to minimise our borrowing. The other pertinent fact is that it does actually include an acknowledgement of the benefits of investor safe schemes. So I would like to pass that forward for recommendation.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Would anyone else like to contribute to debate? No, in which case I move to the seconder, Councillor Birch.
I'm happy to support the motion. The paper is very detailed and is a very positive programme that has been put together with great care, not just for the next year, but also keeps an eye on those longer term commitments. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Councillor Hayden, would you like to sum up?
Without repeating myself, I think I'd like to move it straight to the vote. Recommendations as already said, set out.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Once again, colleagues, if anybody does not support this, please show now. And as there's no movement there by assent, that is passed unanimously, and thank you very much indeed. And colleagues, it won't be any surprise, therefore, that item 9, agenda item 9, is the general fund revenue budget for 2021-22. That again is to be introduced by the Director of Resources. Thanks, Mr. McKellar.
Thanks, Chair. So the draft revenue budget proposals were published for consultation by the Executive back in December. And 2 days after that, the provisional local government finance settlement was announced. That confirmed a number of our assumptions that we'd made in the development of the draft proposals, but it included some additional one-off grants over and above the level which we were anticipating. So that has given the Council some one-off additional flexibility in 21-22, which the final paper and final proposals which Councillor Hayden will introduce shortly will cover. In terms of the consultation itself, there were a grand total of 3 responses to the consultation, one of which was not from one of the participants in this Zoom call this evening. So a disappointing response, I think is fair to say. The one response from a member of the public, I think, also missed the point a little bit around the Council's journey over the last number of years, with comments such as the Council has not yet cut its cloth. I think the report makes clear that there are over £3 million worth of savings in the 21-22 budget. That's on top of around £95 million worth of savings that this council has made since becoming a unitary authority back in 1998. So I think there is ample evidence there that the council certainly has taken lots of measures over the years to reduce expenditure wherever possible. So in terms of the final proposals, there are some updates to the draft budget proposals in paragraph 8.3. The most significant of those are the normal updating of the pressures for social care, because that's a demand-led service. Inevitably, the level of demand changes between the draft budget preparations in November and the final budget considerations in February. So we every year include the more up-to-date figures. So in this year, what we're seeing is greater certainty about a higher level of pressures based on the number of clients receiving care and the cost of that care. However, because we're getting closer to the end of the year and the level of risks which we had anticipated back in December have not yet come to fruition, and we don't expect they will do, then the actual worst case scenario we were predicting back in December is coming down. So that is good news. Another significant change relates to the focus of the organisation on dealing with the response to COVID, most particularly over the last couple of months, where clearly caseloads everywhere in the country have been incredibly high, and the work of our social care teams has been very much around managing and helping health with the impact of that. The inevitable consequence of that is that it has not been possible to take forward some of the transformation work in the timescales that we had hoped. So therefore, some of the transformation savings, which were in the December proposals, have been deferred for a period of around 6 months in the final proposals. As I said earlier, there is scope to have some one-off flexibility financially. So the report does include some one-off investments, which I'm sure Councillor Hayden will talk to there in paragraph 11.3a to f. In that respect, one of them was the subject of discussion at the Employment Committee last week, and that was the proposed retention payments to staff. Now, the Employment Committee confirmed, but wished to emphasise that it was as a one-off basis that they could understand the logic in agreeing a 1% retention payment for staff excluding the corporate management team next year. And they also believe that it may be necessary to look at other measures in the year on a more targeted basis, and they would like the opportunity to do so. And the funding which has been included within the final budget proposals gives them the scope to do so, should the executive choose to continue those through to council. So that's it in terms of the report. There was an issue in publishing this report that the final local government finance settlement had not been published at the time the papers came out last Monday. It was announced last Thursday. Frustratingly, in many respects, there was a very minor £1,000 change to the numbers from the provisional settlement, and the impact of that will be seen on the recommendation 2.8, which does include a very small contribution from revenue reserves to support the budget. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Councillor Hayden to talk through the updated recommendations, which do include the proposed council tax increase. The papers have been published and are on the website at this moment in time, including those numbers, but I will endeavour to share them, never having done so before through Zoom, but I'm fairly adept at Teams, so hopefully this will work, which will enable everyone involved to actually see the proposals which Councillor Hayden is going to be putting towards you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, before we move to Councillor Hayden, are there any questions at this point for the officer? No, I don't think so. So over to Councillor Hayden, please, to move the recommendation.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to move the recommendations as set out, I think it's page 113 of the papers, section 2, as 2.1 to 2.12, inclusive.
Thank you. Is that seconded, please?
Seconded.
Thank you very much, Councillor Birch. Thank you.
Chairman, could I just remind Councillor Hayden that this includes the updated figures which were published on the website this evening, which aren't on that page in the original agenda papers, but are in front of members at the moment on my screen.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. As always, we thank the Director of Resources and his team for putting together a budget in particularly trying times. They've never been more trying than now. But I think the thanks have to be extended to all the council staff about the pressures that we've been working under this year. Once again, we've provided a balanced and realistic budget in continuing very pressured and uncertain times. And despite the cost pressures, it does include an element of stimulus, and it's also COVID sensitive, if I can borrow the expression from Councillor Birch on that one. The uncertainties during 2020 were unprecedented and unexpected, and they're continuing on into 2021. So it's still looking at it. The context is that there's still a great deal of uncertainty, especially as it's put back the review on the council funding, how it's funded, and also on business rates. So we have to still maintain a very prudent approach. The other thing is that there is a thank you to the government on this as well. The costs and pressures from COVID have been extraordinary, but the government's response has been extraordinary in terms of supporting local authorities in a particularly trying time, because not every authority seems to be succeeding in getting a balanced budget if we follow the news. What is underlying, though, is that the cost pressures on social care, they were there before COVID, they're there during COVID, and they'll still be there after COVID. So unfortunately, we still have to increase our council tax. And as you'll see from the papers, it's actually we're increasing the council tax by 3.49%, which is less than the maximum. We've only taken half the adult social care precept, which has been deferred. And that's in recognition that we also have to support our residents in a time where there's a lot of financial uncertainty. So we kept the increase to a minimum, but I'd like to say, because that means that the average Band D council tax is £1,400 a year, and it's less than £1 a week extra from last year. So given the social pressures, given the additional pressures from COVID and the uncertainties, to be able to produce a budget which is going to cost less than £1 a week, I really would like to thank the council. I mentioned that apart from that, there's also an element of stimulus as well as being COVID sensitive. And the Director of Finance has also mentioned the areas where we're actually trying to stimulate both our economy to support our own staff, but most importantly, to continue supporting vulnerable people. So we are putting together, or we have proposed, additional welfare support for our most vulnerable people. That will include an additional discount on the council tax, which is £150 a month, £150, which is more than a month's council tax for most people. Supporting the local economy, especially the town centres, by recognising the importance, as particularly when you think of the Lexicon is probably one of the largest employers in the borough. Support for individuals experiencing mental health is an issue which we're all aware of. So it helps us both within our own offices and the voluntary sector who've really come up trumps during this time. In recognition, we mentioned earlier in the council about our environmental responsibilities, is that we are creating a fund to support climate change or carbon reduction initiatives. And lastly, again, the Director of Finance mentioned that we are making a staff retention payment. Unfortunately, he's been referred to it otherwise, but it is a staff retention payment. There is a very, very challenging market, particularly for social care, but we're recognising everybody in the council on this, because however much our own staff have some sort of certainty of employment, what the certainty we need to strive for is this certainty of support, particularly for our most vulnerable people. So I'd like to commend this budget to my colleagues for support.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Hayden. Would the seconder like to speak now or reserve?
I'll reserve, if I may, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Dr. Barnard, your hand's up first.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I first of all support everything that Councillor Hayden has said? And again, thank all our officers who, in addition to everything COVID related, have worked on putting together what I think is a very sustainable budget, which very much, I think, puts our residents at the heart of what we do. I think one of the features of Bracknell Forest, going back to the comment that Stuart McKenna made at the front about the residents' intervention, is we choose to make sure that our budget evolves over the years to meet the emerging and understand the future needs of residents wherever possible. The worst thing you can possibly do as a local authority is have to cut services as an emergency knee-jerk reaction to financial problems and issues. And I think by constantly planning ahead, looking at where money can be saved, so we can reinvest it in services elsewhere, so we can take account of the needs of residents through what have been very, very challenging and changing circumstances, means that we can stay ahead of, where we want to be. And in the perspective of the portfolio that I have the privilege of looking after in terms of education, children's social care, this budget supports early intervention and prevention whilst learning on the experience of working within the COVID confines. It also means that the council is continuing to provide proactive support to our schools in terms of helping them support and improve standards through what again have been very challenging times, and more broadly on the social care agenda, doing what we can to meet the needs of our ageing population and the health and social care needs that they have. What I think is really important is that by doing all of those things, that we keep making Bracknell Forest a great place to live and work. By supporting the schemes that we do for young people in the way that we do, we create that opportunity as they set out in adult life. For example, where we're hoping, when the COVID pandemic, eases a bit and we can get out and about, that we can actually welcome young people to our new hub that we've, the building works completed on, which has been a long-standing project. So I think it's a very good budget. But finally, the other thing is, by looking at the council tax rise that we are looking at, although, all increases are never welcome, I think there's a very clear statement there that by as low as possible, that we recognise the financially challenging time our residents are in, and that we're doing our best to make sure that we don't pass on unnecessary rises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dr. Barnard. Thank you. And Councillor Turrell.
Thanks, Leader. Yes, I certainly agree in commending the work that's been done on this budget. What a challenging year, and the only certain thing that's been about it is uncertainty. But I think what this does is to take a considered look at the likely the challenges we've had to deal with, which, yes, have been ably supported by the government financially, as governments around the world over grapple with the best way to deal with this crisis. Going forward, I think it takes an intelligent look at what the likely challenges are likely to be in 2021-22. And that, I think, is extremely important, because if you don't get the budget right, there's an awful lot else that you can't do. And sadly, there are too many examples up and down the country of where local government has come unstuck financially. So it's very important. It's a very good piece of work, and I fully support it.
Thank you very much, Councillor Turrell. Thank you. Councillor Birch.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman. We've heard about cost pressures. We've heard about some of the contribution that's being made by the government to assist us during COVID. And let's face it, every penny is welcome. And we are in this budget having to be mindful of the post-COVID world. And I think that's positive thinking as we look to restart and stand up some of those services that our residents have come to rely on. But it's not about rewinding the clock, etc., and that everything's going back to be the same. I'm pleased to say there's been a lot of learning done during lockdowns and during COVID, and we've learned to be smarter and more efficient, and this budget reflects a lot of that work and a lot of that future commitment. one of the things that has been touched on here, but it's this administration's council's historic competence at producing well-considered and balanced budgets now for, what is it, 21, 22 years, that places us, makes us better positioned to cope with the sort of trouble that we've had recently and are going to continue to have. And the many other councils, and certainly there are one or two that spring to mind. I certainly wouldn't like to be looking at council tax bills in some of the London boroughs at this time. But the interesting thing there, and I drew from a comment made earlier, that there hadn't been many respondents to the consultation. And that may have been because of the confidence that our residents have in this administration to do that job on their behalf and to put that residents' focus first, to make sure that we continue to support our most vulnerable and needy people. And I'm going to add to previous speakers' thanks to all those. But this again is the opportunity to thank all those volunteers that are out there and those volunteer coordinators that are out there doing that, and to all our carers, particularly some of our young carers for whom being a young carer and homeschooling is a very interesting time. But that support has been there and will continue to be there. And one of the things that I reflect on is how many years our opposition has always called upon us to use up all our reserves and so on and so forth, etc. I'd say, isn't it good that we didn't listen to them? Otherwise, where would we have been now? 3.4% is the increase that we're asking. I hope, and I'm pretty sure, the majority of our residents will understand what that's for. And given the success that all the directorates and all the frontline services have been able to report during this difficult time, I hope that our residents will agree that this council and this administration has done an excellent job yet again in bringing forward the best possible budget we could. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councillor Birch. Thank you. And Councillor Hayden, would you like to sum up?
Thank you, Leader. Just to summarise, and I'll pick a few words and expressions used by my colleagues, is that the environment has never been more challenging and uncertain. I think it's become customary that Councillor Birch is very, very proud of our unbroken record of not just delivering a balanced budget, but delivering it to it. And given the troubled times we're in, our confidence is very, very high that we'll continue to deliver to our budget. The other major point is that it is, I'll quote Councillor Turrell on this, is that it's an intelligent and forward-looking budget as well, because we are recognising the challenges to our residents, both financial and otherwise, and giving them certainty of support, particularly those most vulnerable, from a council that is both caring and a great place to work, in recognition of some of the staff that have worked this year. So it's residents first and certainty of support. The cost, when there's a lot of financial pressure, is typically less than £1 a week to actually keep all our residents safe and secure. We're making contributions to the borough going forward in terms of the environment, looking to make sure economically we're able to make a positive contribution to growing the place as a great place to live and work. So without further ado, I'd like to commend the recommendations to my colleagues, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Hayden. Thank you. Well, colleagues, if anybody does not support this recommendation, would they please show now? And I don't see anybody showing, so by assent, that is unanimously moved, and thank you very much indeed to Councillor Hayden, and indeed to our Director of Resources, Mr. McKellar, and his team. That, colleagues, concludes today's business. So that closes this formal part of the meeting. Thank you.
I think your technology just made it. Thank you, Chairman.